Lots of people think, well, there are no objective values. Somehow objective values are, belief in objective values is a relic of the past. In a modern scientific age, we have to give up the idea that there can be objective values. Not all naturalists believe that, as I mentioned. There are the Cornell moral realists, but many people, perhaps a majority of analytic philosophers, think that objective values are some kind of an illusion, and because somehow what could they be? How could they fit into a scientific world picture? Well, partly I think that's a confusion because it assumes that if ethics is objective, then it must be a description. So already the kind of picture of language is very uniform, and all having one way of functioning is already, I think, built in a lot of the worries about ethics. But also, the same people often are quite comfortable in talking about, say, justification in science, or rational acceptability, or warranted assertability, and so on, without a qualm. And yet, being warranted, being simple, being coherent, being plausible, these are value terms. They're not moral value terms, but they are what we would call epistemic value terms. In fact, in the 19th century, axiology, as Peirce understood it, included both a theory of epistemic value and a theory of moral value. And in fact, all of the arguments which are customarily used to argue that ethics can't be objective, for example, well, cultures disagree, and we don't know whether we'll ever all come into agreement on, and so on. All of these objections could be raised against epistemic values. There are disagreements between cultures on what's simple, what's plausible, what's more coherent than what. It's sometimes argued there's something funny about the notion of obligation. It somehow seems both something you can believe and something that's action guiding, and that's queer. But believing that a theory is superior all around to another on the score of plausibility, simplicity, coherence, is also action guiding. I want to say that, of course, somebody like Rorty would welcome this. He would say, see, you should give up all notions of objectivity. I think more people, if they came to see that Rorty is right in the following sense, that if you don't believe in ethical objectivity, then consistency, if those are your reasons, then consistency requires you give up epistemic objectivity as well. I think more people would agree with me that that's the best argument there could be for hanging on to moral objectivity, rather than agree with Rorty in giving the whole idea of objectivity up.
If you look at the arguments against realism, it seems to me that they imply or support a kind of irrealism or anti-realism about value generally. So, to explain a little bit, people typically object to a realist understanding of morality by arguing that, well, morality or moral judgments have various kinds of features, and since they have these features, they're just never literally true. So people point out facts about sort of diversity. There's a lot of disagreement about morality, and since there's disagreement about morality, moral judgments probably are not true. After all, if they were true, people argue that more people would see them, there would be less diversity, less disagreement, so on and so forth. People have often also argued that moral judgments have a kind of motivational impact to them. If you say something's wrong, but you just have sort of no pull against doing that action, you really wouldn't be saying it's wrong, and any sort of judgment that has that sort of pull just can't be a belief. It has to be an expression of something, and so those sorts of expressions are neither true nor false, or not the state of mind that is sort of either true or false. So people point to various features of moral judgments and say, since they have those, and anything having those features is sort of not true, moral judgments aren't true. And what I did in my dissertation 5 years, 6 years ago or so was basically provided a counterexample to this premise that says any judgment with these features is never true. Well, I pointed out that all sorts of intellectual and scientific judgments seem to have these features as well. Morality is often about what you should and shouldn't do from a moral point of view, but it seems like there's questions about what you should and shouldn't believe and reason from an intellectual point of view, an epistemic point of view, a scientific point of view. But there's these questions about should and shouldn't. And I argued that it seems that these shoulds and shouldn'ts have the same, or often have the same sort of features moral judgments have. But since we tend to think that these kinds of should claims are sometimes true, that's a counterexample to the general premise. The sort of typical arguments against realism have a false premise. Another way to put it is kind of call it a sort of same boat argument. Some people want to put moral judgments in a boat, so to speak, because they have these sort of features and, they're like this, so they're problematic. So they're in this class. Well, what I did was pointed out that lots of things, lots of kinds of judgments seem to have these same kinds of features, but we seem to be able to accept them as literally true. So that undercuts this kind of argument against it. And if there's a way that sort of scientific, intellectual, epistemic shoulds and oughts and musts and so on, these kinds of value judgments, if those can be true, then presumably so can moral judgments. Suppose you think that, you really should have a good argument for a view, for whatever sort of view you hold. And, if there's an objection to it, you really ought to be able to respond to it. Suppose you think things like that. It seems like you can say also that, look, I don't see where that's sort of written on the universe or whatever, that you should have reasons for what you think, or that, if you don't find reasons for something, you shouldn't accept it. Those things to me seem to be sort of equally mysterious as morality. And the point of my dissertation was basically that, well, if you can accept shoulds like that, then it seems like you should be able to accept moral shoulds too. If you can find sort of intellectual or epistemic value, then why not moral value too?